Hey guys, my name's Walter. I'm a data science lead at Gauntlet. This is going to be a pretty data-driven presentation. I'm going to draw a lot of pretty graphs on the board or the projector. So yeah, hopefully it's a visual presentation. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about restaking flows today. Given the many restaking platforms active today, like your eigenlayers, your symbiotics, Jito on Solana, even in the modular ecosystems such as Milky Way. Makes sense that stake and assets can sort of move or flow between these platforms. So I'm going to be discussing a little bit on some of the relationships and some of the patterns that you see in these flows, and sort of talk about what that might mean for the services that do rely on the stake as sort of cryptoeconomic security. So these are some of the problems that we explore here at Gauntlet. We're the leading cryptoeconomic research firm where we specialize in quantitative optimization and modeling at the forefront of DeFi. And we're quite proud that our models have helped secure billions of dollars across the space. We drive immense growth across numerous dozens of protocols. Particularly in restaking, we've worked with Eigenlayer, we work with Puffer, Swell, EtherFi to sort of help drive the space forward. Can everyone hear me? I don't know how loud this is. So yeah, this is a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking today. I'll first introduce what restaking flows are, give a brief overview on what restaking currently looks like. I'll go into some of the relationships and the patterns that we've seen so far, and then finally conclude with how can we use these sorts of flows, what insights can we derive from them to sort of help mitigate risks going forward in restaking. So yeah, restaking, as everyone probably knows, is the hottest paradigm of 2024, or going back into the later stage of 2023. At a high level, it's basically taking that sort of ETH that's being used to secure the L1 and repurposing it to secure secondary services on top. And these secondary services can be, wide-ranging. They can be oracles, bridges, DA layers, shared sequencers, et cetera, et cetera. How it works is basically operators take that stake that's delegated to them by users, and they help perform a set of tasks for these services. If they perform these tasks pretty well, they get paid out a reward. Likewise, their stakers that delegate to them get paid out that reward as well. If they don't perform these tasks well, or if they're malicious, they incur an economic penalty, which means their stake gets slashed. And the things that facilitate all these interactions are what we call the restaking platforms, or what I like to call the marketplace. I like to call them marketplaces because they sort of help match that collateral supply, security supply, with the protocols and the infrastructure that sort of demand that security as well. And the one aspect in restaking that has developed over the past couple of months has been the choice of asset, or the choice of collateral that people can use in restaking. Originally, in its first forms, restaking was only limited to staked ETH or its liquid variants. But today, you can sort of see that general trend where any sort of ERC20 can be used as collateral in restaking. You can see on the left, probably the text is a little small, but you can see all those types of assets that you can use as collateral in Eigenlayer. It goes through all the LSTs and some native protocol tokens like Renzo as well. And on the right, you can see Symbiotic. It's a little too small, but probably the biggest one on there is WBTC. That's not an LST. Oftentimes, users deposit these assets through third-party providers that sort of give back a liquid token in itself. This is what we call the LRT, or liquid restaking token. And the primary benefit of this is that it helps unlock that stake that would otherwise be locked in restaking. Yeah, so given all this variation, the types of marketplaces, the types of assets, it makes sense that stake can flow or move between these marketplaces. It can flow or move between them, or it can flow or move from restaking and out of the ecosystem in general. Perhaps on Symbiotic, a new ERC20 launched where users on Eigenlayer want to sort of rebalance out of their restaking portfolio into a new asset on Symbiotic. Or in a more extreme example, you can consider a big capital provider that's been in restaking for a while, suddenly seeing a lot of risks. Maybe they're a little concerned with operator performance in the past couple of weeks. Maybe they're concerned about new types of slashing risks. So they would decide to withdraw all of their stake from the restaking ecosystem. This sort of means that, this crypto economic security is not really static. In fact, it's very dynamic, and it depends on a lot of the mechanisms and the assets behind that drive these sort of marketplaces. Which means that being able to sort of quantify this flow and change of stake can give color into sort of understanding what these staking dynamics are like. If we can sort of quantify these flows across, time dimensions, say like whether it's like an hour from now or a day from now, what types of assets are being moved, if they're like ETH-based, LSTs, WBTC, other native protocol assets, et cetera. Even like how they're being staked, right? If they're going through LRTs first or they're being deposited directly into the restaking marketplace. Being able to sort of quantify this basically helps us form a contour, a mental contour of how restaking, like what those dynamics actually are. And if we can form that sort of contour, then we can know the gradients of that contour. If we know the gradients, we can sort of, capture when changes in one variable, such as the loss in stake, the flows in stake, and that how that like can directly translate into understanding the risk of the ecosystem as a whole. So yeah, what are some of these flows? What have we seen so far? I'll first talk about symbiotic. I'll capture this through the blue line here. I think the numbers are a little small. Even I can't see them from here, so I'll try to make my best guess. But yeah, the blue line is representing the symbiotic flows, and the green line shows the flows in symbiotic, specifically attributed to LRTs in symbiotic. And a big part of the LRTs in symbiotic are like the Mellow vaults and stuff. For more context, Mellow is basically a protocol that facilitates third-party curation in these LRTs. Basically, users can deposit their stake with third-party providers in return for that third-party provider's LRT or liquid restaking token. And Mellow sort of aggregates all the stake, deposit, and like puts it into symbiotic. If we look at the blue line, we can see it's, I guess it's quite spiky. You can see that the growth is pretty well defined by the sort of the cap structure that symbiotic imposes. Symbiotic imposes a cap structure on the deposits to upper bound the risk in the ecosystem, basically limiting the assets that can be put in these initial stages. And you can see based on the spike in early July, mid-August, that sort of huge vertical jump, that there's really explosive growth in symbiotic right after these cap raises, which makes sense, right? Interestingly, if you look at the green line, which shows the LRT flows, you can see that it sort of appreciates a lot more smoothly, right? That growth is more stable in a sense. And it's pretty interesting because these symbiotic LRTs sort of form an intermediary deposit source. And it sort of implies that as long as symbiotic, or like there's some expectation that symbiotic will continue to accept caps down the road, that symbiotic restaking will grow, that these sort of intermediary deposit sources can continue to attract demand and can continue to grow. So we can compare some of these flows with eigenlayer. Here the purple line shows the LST flows in eigenlayers, like denominated in LSTs. And the red line shows the flows in eigenlayer that you can attribute to LRTs that will proxy with Renzo and EtherFi in this instance. You can see that basically purple line is going down, LST flow is just going out of the ecosystem. On net, it seems like around 220K of LSTs are withdrawn. If you look at the red line, it's a little more interesting. You can see a lot more inflows into eigenlayer via LRT deposits. Back in June, like EtherFi, Renzo, people were depositing to that. But then you can sort of see that, sharp drop, right? Like right there, it's just like declines like that. That was due to a mechanism change, right? So Renzo activated their withdrawal queue, basically allowing users to redeem their easy ETH for the underlying ETH behind it. And once that sort of withdrawal demand subsided, it sort of returned back to its upward trend before. So it's pretty interesting, right? Like there's a sort of mechanism change that happened that sort of reversed the flow direction. If you compare the two of them together, you sort of see something else as well, right? You can sort of see that in the beginning, symbiotic and eigenlayer together are growing, but then it was this sort of mechanism change that I just described that really disrupted the inertia behind the eigenlayer flows in the beginning. And once that withdrawal demand subsided, it returned back to its original trend. On the other hand, if you look at symbiotic, like directly comparing symbiotic and I guess the net flows in eigenlayer over time, the most obvious thing you can see is that the blue line goes up and the purple line goes down, which suggests that there's some sort of, perhaps a migration of stake between, symbiotic into eigenlayer. But if you observe a little more closely, you can probably I guess the numbers are too hard to see here, but the magnitude in the purple line is a little different from the magnitude in the blue line. And what this can tell us is that, hey, we know there is like a migration between symbiotic and eigenlayer, but perhaps not all the stake is moving from symbiotic into eigenlayer. And if that is the case, if we don't know where that stake is going, where is that stake possibly going, right? So if you do this analysis, you'll find that, like, I think throughout the 3 months, June, July, August, yeah, it's 3 months, okay. You'll see that, like, of the 1 million ETH that was withdrawn from eigenlayer, roughly 200K is deposited into symbiotic. These users that are directly transferring between eigenlayer into symbiotic, they're withdrawing like 170K ETH from eigenlayer, depositing 210K ETH into symbiotic. And this 210K ETH represents like roughly 40% of the overall 500K ETH TVL in symbiotic, which sort of shows that, hey, like a lot of the TVL in symbiotic is directly coming from eigenlayer. But if you consider the inverse of that, specifically this 167 versus the 1 mil, you'll only find that like roughly 15 to 20% of that stake leaving eigenlayer is sort of being recycled into the rest of the restaking ecosystem, right? So this recycling figure is pretty interesting in itself, right? We all know that currently there's no slashing, there's no payments, restaking is not really live yet, right? But what this does tell us is that, hey, should these things go live in the end, what does this recycling number like actually look like in the end? If this recycling number is a lot lower, that means that continued deposits into the restaking ecosystem as a whole remains even more important, right? If we have a steady case of withdrawals from eigenlayer without the necessary deposits to go back to it, for the services that do rely on that crypto economic security, you could imagine that over time, that decay will lead to like a loss or a deficit in that security, which means that continue to incentivize like, healthy deposits, sufficient stake remains incredibly important. So what does this basically mean in the end? To summarize, we talked about a couple things. We talked about, hey, there's like an inertia in like a lot of the flow that you see in eigenlayer and symbiotic, and this flows towards some equilibrium, right? Eventually, like, there's like all this stake in eigenlayer, right? The stake has to be paid out via points or somehow. Naturally, there's going to be some kind of upper barrier there. You then see that sort of this mechanism change, and a lot of the triggers can break this inertia, right? When Renzo activated their withdrawal queue, it also had a spillover effect into EtherFi, which led to, a greater source of withdrawals from the ecosystem. And you'll notice that these flows are sort of two-dimensional in both magnitude and the type of asset, right? And we sort of concluded this with, or like drew an insight from this where it's like, hey, X% of the stake is recycled in the restaking system, and 1 minus X%, not 1 minus X, 100 minus X% leaves the system in the end. So basically, it's therefore important to mitigate the effects of stake churn on their economic security, right? So what are some of the solutions that we can take to address this? Something I talked about earlier as well was sort of that general trend where we see a lot of general like any sort of ERC20, that pattern for restaking marketplaces to adopt them as crypto economic security. So yeah, here's a chart that shows a lot of the non-ETH based assets across the marketplaces, SUSD, FXS, Eigen, EtherFi, WBTC. And you can sort of see that a lot of the growth trajectories in these assets on the marketplaces, follows a pretty similar pattern, right? The growth is quite explosive in the beginning and then tapers off. This suggests that, hey, there's a lot of latent, I guess, supply available there that can be used as that crypto economic security, should that be needed, right? And the natural question that follows up from this is like, hey, if I'm a service, if I'm an AVS on Eigenlayer, if I'm a network on Symbiotic, what is the best way for me to take advantage of the fact that there's a lot of assets for me to pick from, right? What is the best portfolio? What is the configuration of those assets? The type of asset, the weight to place on each asset when used for my task validation to actually reduce the risk that my service actually faces. So there are a couple characteristics here. My colleague Jacob Kim actually talked about this in KBW a couple weeks ago. But the two characteristics are like, hey, a good restaking collateral has price stability, and its balance in the restaking system is pretty stable as well, right? Basically, it's low volatile, and it remains it's pretty robust to flows outward. Basically, the balanced portfolio of stake that services can use, the ideal portfolio, really sorts of draws that middle ground, that ideal point between these two axes, right? The volatility part and the elasticity part. If you can find the correct balance here, you can mitigate the risks associated with steady stake outflow in that particular guard. Another way you can do it is sort of like a multi-marketplace approach for services. Basically, services can aggregate stake across a variety of marketplaces to inform their cryptoeconomic security. This is just a toy example here, but yeah, basically, service B in the first example is like, I'm only on marketplace 1. Service A has a, what do you call it? Profit from corruption. Basically, if someone attacks that service, what's the profit you can sort of obtain from it? If it's not on both marketplaces, it basically suffers a loss in economic security, where that available security is actually less than the profit of corruption, which makes it more like susceptible to an adversarial attack afterwards, right? This is just a really small toy example, but like it does highlight the fact that, hey, if you sort of aggregate stake across a variety of marketplaces, if you have a very diversified source of security, you can reduce a lot of these sort of adversarial risks. So yeah, so I'll finally close out with a different type of chart here, I guess. We talked a lot today about restaking flows in particular assets moving across marketplaces. I'll present to you guys like a different sense of flow, basically the flow between registrations on EigenLayer. So the graph stops. But basically, the blue dots on the left show like various operators, and the green dots on the right show various services. And each edge that you can see connecting between the two is like a new registration. And the green lines show like new registrations, and the red lines show like registrations that are leaving the ecosystem. Basically, in the end, when we talk about stake loss, when we talk about flows and stake, what we're most concerned about is the reflexivity of this stake, right? When stake leaves at T0, what's going to happen at T1 or T2? Is more stake going to leave? And a lot of research we've done at Gauntlet has shown that, yeah, under insufficient incentives, this can actually happen. If we do see a slashing event and we see that, hey, there's a lot of actual corruption probabilities and adversarial potential, a lot of stake will leave the system. You can see like cascading stake loss in that particular regard. In the end, one of the most important questions to answer is, how do you find that really good equilibrium? How do you have services not overpay for their security in the end? And how can we maintain like robust security in general across the ecosystem? Yeah. Thanks, guys. Opening up the questions.